Hello, Our Saviors. My name is Greg Wickler. I am Our Saviors Council's treasurer. And today I'm going to be presenting the fiscal year 2024 budget presentation to the congregation. This is a video recording, and we thought we would do this recording in advance of our upcoming congregational meeting in June. This is a way to dive a little bit deeper into the details of the budget, so that when we get to the congregational meeting, hopefully we'll be able to move through that approval process a little faster. So what I'd like to do first is just go over the process that we engaged in to develop the budget for this fiscal year, and actually for most fiscal year budget preparations activities, we do the same general process. So the first thing is we launched a stewardship campaign that was launched in early April. You all were asked to pledge, and we gave you multiple options to make your pledge, either through the traditional card approach or through a Gmail or a electronic method. We also promoted the campaign through blurbs in our Sunday bulletin, as well as our email, a few email campaigns, and I even got up to the podium and made the plea live several times in April. We developed from that information from the stewardship campaign and the pledges that were received. We were able to develop a forecast of receipts or revenue, if you will. The giving figures that I'll present today are based on actual pledges, as well as estimates for those folks that we didn't receive pledges for, but we were able to estimate giving based on historical giving trends. We also project revenue for our facility partner activities, and those are based on actual leases that we have in place with our tenants, as well as expected upcoming events that we put on through the Creekside Commons. Our expense forecasts were also developed in the budgeting process. So we have 4 expense categories. The first one is mission and outreach, and that's really a method that's based on a 10% formula. 10% of our giving is earmarked, is set aside for mission, which includes 2 elements: mission and outreach. So the partners that nonprofits that we partner with, both on the local basis as well as international. And then the other component is our giving to the Senate. Second category is staff costs. So staff costs include the salaries plus the fringe benefits that we provide to our staff members. The third category of expenses is administrative costs, and this is really the cost to keep the lights on. So it's the utility cost, it's the insurance, it's the maintenance, it's the janitorial services, etc. And then finally, our programs and our costs for programs and events. So programmatic being the different activities that we have here at Our Saviors from a programmatic standpoint, including our music and our children's ministry, etc. So our budget is balanced through a series of steps that include making adjustments to our expenses based on what we project, and making some adjustments downward typically based on what we estimate, and making those adjustments. And then we make stretch assumptions in the budget as well, based on expectations of what we might assume to be greater levels of giving, more revenue from facility partners, etc. And then finally, we actually make transfers from designated funds that we have accumulated for the purpose of covering our deficits. All right, so some of the results here. The stewardship campaign was a great success. We were able to hear from 45 families in terms of pledges actually received. So in that pledging process, we were able to determine that almost $250,000 of giving would be essentially made available for the budget. And then we made estimates for another 40 families based on really reasonable assumptions of past giving patterns. Many families actually do simply giving and may not necessarily submit a pledge card, but continue to be giving to our Saviors. So we're able to basically come up with another $90,000 of estimates. So that total, in total, between the pledges and the estimates, we're assuming is $335,000 of giving revenue for the fiscal year. And I think it's helpful to know how that giving compares to previous years. So I have here 4 years of giving history, the number of pledges received going back to fiscal year 2021, which was actually middle of 2020 to middle of 2021, and then fiscal year 22, 23, and then the current fiscal year 24. So you can see that number on the right-hand side of the table there, 45 pledges, $335,000 of expected giving. And that, if you go back in time, you see that the numbers are fairly consistently higher in previous years. So we're seeing a slight decline in giving, not too significantly. In fact, for this fiscal year, we're projecting a slight increase in giving just based on the trends and the expectations that we're able to estimate. It's helpful to also compare the estimates of giving to what actually was received for that particular fiscal year. So we have 3 years of data going back to fiscal year 2021. And then what's instructive is to say, okay, well, let's see how accurate our forecast of giving was relative to what actually happened. And it's generally in the mid-90s percent. In other words, 90% of what it was actually received, 98% in the case of fiscal year 2021 was actually forecasted, was actually received. So our forecasts are fairly accurate if you go back in time. Okay, so the initial draft budget, what we do is a process of putting the budget together, comparing that, basically matching up the giving with the expenses, and then try to understand then what that looks like. And initially, our first round or first cut at it was that we had a pretty sizable deficit. That always happens. You know, you never can be exactly right on the money when you're doing forecasts of budgets, but it means that we have to do some pencil sharpening in the process. I think there's some factors that I wanted to note as to why that deficit position was realized, at least in the initial stage. First is our actual giving revenue has, as I mentioned before, has steadily declined over the years. A number of factors there are our donors, a lot of our regular donors have either passed or moved out of the area or just simply left the church. But it's important to note that nevertheless, our giving remains strong. And that's really heartening to know that even has continued throughout this challenging pandemic period. On the expense side, our expenses projected for this next year are quite a bit higher than they were even in this current year. So increased operational expenses, insurance, utilities, maintenance of this property. As we all know, this is an older building, and it requires a lot more maintenance, and that maintenance cost has to be factored into the budgeting. We have some increased staff costs due to some temporary, we have a temporary staff position that we're going to embark into, do some database cleanup for for this upcoming few months with the summer interns, so that's an additional cost. We have some additional healthcare costs with adding more staff, and increasing staff hours means that we're putting in more healthcare costs there. We also have an increased across the board staff salaries just due to cost of living adjustments. And then finally, we added costs in for our transition of the leadership with Pastor Dan's upcoming retirement in next May. So we had to factor those costs into our expenses. Our revenue on the Creekside Commons is offsetting some of this rather dark news, in the sense that there is a lot of good news on the Creekside Commons side of things, because our revenues are steadily increasing on that side, which is great, and that is really helping us overcome any of our deficits that we're projecting. But I think that we're seeing that there's some increases in costs, as I mentioned, for cost of living adjustments, and we've done some trimming and adjusting or moving around different staff positions to try to consolidate some of those cost increases. So some of the actions specifically that we took to close the gap. So first thing we did is we adjusted the major facility maintenance budget specifically to $40,000. It was actually $38,000 in this current fiscal year, so we felt like a modest increase was warranted, but not a significant increase. We also we're going to make 2 transfers from our operating reserve account. This is our designated fund account that is specifically set aside for essentially our rainy day fund. Whenever we have any deficit positions, we close that deficit with our operating reserve account. And our balance by the end of this calendar year is expected to be about $90,000. So we feel like there's a sufficient amount of reserve in there to cover deficits. And we're going to do that in 2 phases. The first phase will be at the beginning of January of 2024, when we expect that we're going to make a transfer of around $6,000. And then, excuse me, by the end of the fiscal year, which would be June of 2024, in July, the month after, we're going to transfer the balance to essentially reach our zero deficit position. And that's estimated to be another $40,000. So $46,000 out of a total balance available of about $90,000. And then we're also making 2 reasonable challenge components to the budget. So the first one is Creekside Commons. We're going to challenge our folks on that side to come up with about $5,000 more of revenue on that in terms of Creekside Commons facility rentals, and then increase our assumptions about giving from another $5K, from $335 to $340K of giving on the OSLC side. So what does this all mean? And this is a busy table. I'm not going to walk through every number here. There's a lot of numbers here, but what I wanted to do was sort of point out the overview of how the table is constructed. And this will be the budget that will be voted on in the June 11th congregational meeting. So what I did in the columns is I put together an estimate of the fiscal year 2023, that's the current year, in terms of all of our receipts and then all of our expenses, and then how that balances out. So in fiscal year 2024, I've separated out the receipts and the expenses for Creekside Commons versus OSLC. So Creekside Commons is revenue through our facility partnerships, whether those are the leases or one-time rentals that we have to other entities. And then OSLC is really revenue is the giving. And then on the expense side, we do have a method for splitting up expenses between Creekside Commons and OSLC based on, depending on the position. If it's some of Pastor Dan's time, for example, is dedicated to most of his time, the bulk of his time is dedicated to OSLC, but there is a little bit of administrative time to oversee some of the activities on the Creekside Commons side. For Carrie, our office manager, that split is obviously a bit more significant on Creekside Commons because she has to essentially manage the relationship that we have with our tenants. And then, so the total there in the next column to the right is just the sum of the Creekside Commons plus OSLC. And what we did was we also developed a 6-month budget just to kind of show some granularity in terms of timing, since we're entering into a period where we're going to have a lot of transition and a lot of change. So we thought it would be helpful to just split the budget into 2 components just for illustration purposes. And I just wanted to note that the splitting between the first half of the fiscal year and the second half of the fiscal year is not a 50-50 split, because we anticipate some higher costs in the second half of the fiscal year just due to the some of the leadership transitions and such. So that's why that number there at the bottom of almost $300,000 is not necessarily 1/2 of the total of 631. So with that in mind, I just kind of go through the totals. As I said, we expect with all the revenue projections, both on the OSLC side and the Creekside Commons side, to total, and with the challenge, the challenge of the congregation, Creekside Commons, as well as the fund transfers, that we expect the budget to be $631,000, and that matches the expenses that we were able to come up with after we made some adjustments on the expense side. So 631 on revenue, 631 on expenses means that we have a 0 deficit position that we're going to ask the congregation to vote on in June. And I just wanted to compare that to this current fiscal year. Things are really good financially on our finances. I'll say that we're expecting actually a slight surplus to end the year in a slight surplus, thanks in large part to your generous giving, and thanks in large part also to our revenue that we were able to obtain through Creekside Commons. So those 2 pieces are really good news, and we're able to actually finish the fiscal year with a slight surplus as opposed to a deficit. That surplus, just for notation, the surplus goes into that reserve account that I mentioned earlier, and that's just essentially our accumulation of funds that we have in place on the designated fund side to account for any rainy days that we might have from a financial perspective. So just to sum up what this all means in terms of next steps. So our most immediate next step is to essentially have you all approve the fiscal year 2024 budget as it was presented here today, and then again briefly during the June 11th congregational meeting. So that's number 1. Second thing is that, as many of you know, we have a transitional task force in place. I'm a member of that transitional task force as your treasurer. So we will be carrying out our work through the end of this calendar year. So by the end of it says through the end of 2024. It's a typo. It should be the end of 2023. And there's a potential for a revised budget for the second half of the fiscal year, getting us to June of 2024. So that's why the work that the transitional task force is doing is really critical and important in terms of identifying where we might need to go, both expense and receipts, both sides of those equation, as we enter the second half of the fiscal year from January to June of 2024. And then, depending on what is the outcome of the transitional task force, the congregation will be presented with a possible revised fiscal 2024 budget to potentially approve for the remainder of that fiscal year, which would probably be, timing-wise, would be somewhere in the first quarter of 2024, so sometime between January and March of 2024. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and I'll look forward to engaging you much more as we get into the details here, but thanks for your attention.